we will present you the two consultation documents. We'll speak about the process and open the floor for questions. So you will have the opportunity to ask questions. Before moving on, some housekeeping items. So first of all participants are muted now, and they will be muted during the presentation. Participants, you will be able to share questions and comments via the chat functions, and that will be shared with the presenters. They are called panelists in the WebEx terminology. You can also use the raise hand function. So you have this button close to your name. If time permits, then your line will be unmuted, so you can ask verbally your question. This event is recorded, and the recording will be published on the IAS website. And lastly, for any of you who are connecting by phone only, you can download the presentation on the IAS website and you can follow along. So with that, we can now move on to the first section of this call, with the consultation on the development of the liquidity metrics. And for that, I will turn to Michael Pope, the chair of the Macroprudential Monitoring Working Group, and Matt Walker, the vice chair of the Macroprudential Monitoring Working Group, for the presentation. So Michael and Matt, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Romain. Look, yeah, good afternoon, everybody, also from my side. Today, I will focus a bit on the background around the metric before Matt will go a bit more into the details of the metric itself. Last year, the IAS adopted the holistic framework, and one of the three key pillars of the holistic frameworks is the so-called Global Monitoring Exercise, or GME. The GME is designed to assess trends and developments, as well as the potential or possible build-up of systemic risk in the global insurance sector. As part of this assessment, the IAS looks at potential systemic risk arising on the one hand from a sector-wide trend, or on the other hand also like on an individual insurer level. For the IAM, the IAS is using the updated assessment methodology that has also been used in the past, but just has been updated over the course of the years. The IAS can also use ancillary indicators to support the assessment of the possible systemic risks. Within the IAM, such ancillary indicators do not affect the calculated score for firms, but they are supposed to provide additional context around the pure scoring in the overall assessment. And liquidity assessment is an example of one of such an ancillary indicator. Then if you go to the next slide, there you can see that this was already like foreseen in the GME document that was published last year in paragraph 58, where it states the IAS is currently developing liquidity metrics. These liquidity metrics will serve as a tool for the IAS to assess insurers' liquidity exposure. They will not be binding requirements, but rather a monitoring tool. I think this is an important point to stress, and will help identify trends in insurer and insurance sector liquidity. The IAS plans to consult on the metrics for liquidity monitoring in 2020 and 2021. So at this point, like we're in the first phase of like the two phases that the IAS had been foreseeing, and this first phase means the IAS is developing an insurance liquidity ratio, or also ILR, which will use a so-called exposure approach, or EA as an abbreviation. And this is also like the purpose of today's calls and the content of the public consultation document that you can find on the website. In a second phase, the IAS will then further develop the liquidity metrics and also looking at a company projection approach. And this second approach then may also utilize projections of cash flows from the insurance companies. As already said, the current consultation focus on like the first step, which is like the insurance liquidity ratio. And this will be built as a monitoring on ancillary indicator going forward. During next year, the IAS will also further work on this metric to finalize the approach and also look into like the second phase as already outlined before. And then later next year in autumn, probably you will see another consultation on the second phase. The overall plan of the IAS is to finish the liquidity monitoring metrics in 2022. So now I would hand over to Matt Walker, who is leading the development of this liquidity metrics to give you a bit more details on the approach as it's currently in the consultation document.
Thanks, Michael. I'm going to try to keep this short to save as much time as I can for questions because I think the paper mostly speaks for itself, but I do want to give you a chance to ask any questions you have at this stage before you start contemplating submitting feedback, which we are very much looking forward to receiving. One thing we heard loudly and clearly from your prior feedback is that in the past with the designation methodology, the IAS has needed to do more to measure not only the liquidity risk on the liabilities, which we had a couple indicators on, but also match that with a view of asset liquidities. So as Michael said, this is the first kind of step and phase in that work. We wanted to do something that matches what we've done on liquidity needs with liquidity sources. Just initially, we want to do something simple, low burden, that does have some comparability across companies. The downside is that it's not as risk sensitive as some other metrics we could have potentially developed. And we're going to look at supplementing this and with different views as part of the next phase of this methodology where we will consider the company projection approach. So if you could turn to slide 6 now. So I think in terms of the basics of the ILR, the form of this should be fairly familiar to people on this call. We're looking at liquidity sources over liquidity needs. The time horizon of 1 year aligns with what a lot of companies are doing in their own liquidity stress testing. We recognize that insurers, relative to some of the other approaches we looked at, such as what's done for banks or even some rating agency views, the 1 year can be longer, but this aligns with the longer term nature of many insurance liabilities. And even though liquidity scenarios tend to play out over months or even years rather than days or weeks, although certainly there can be that dimension as well. So we took a 1 year horizon to start. We're also focused on general accounts. We're excluding from this any sort of products that are sold where the liquidity risk isn't borne by the insurer, but rather it's borne by the policyholder. Just initially, we wanted to focus on general accounts and the actual insurer's liquidity risk. And one limitation of our view, and I think this is a limitation of any sort of a consolidated enterprise-wide metric, is that we're really not capturing fungibility. We know this. We still think there's some value to having an enterprise-wide view of liquidity, and this aligns with a lot of the other work we've been doing at the IAS. Our designation methodology looks at enterprises group-wide, and our data for the ILR is coming from that. So it would have been very difficult for us to do something sort of legal entity-based here because we just don't have that data. It would have been a massive undertaking, not only on our side, but have to ask for insurers to submit that kind of granularity. So just starting with something more high level that I think does have some value. If we could turn to slide 7 on liquidity sources. So we looked at different options. So I think we had done some work on the liquidity needs side as part of the designation methodology. We need to develop this liquidity sources side more for consultation. We tried to do something just based on what others had done. We surveyed the academic literature, but frankly, there wasn't a lot of academic work to quantify how liquid different asset classes are. So we're left with supervisory judgment, and you'll see within the consultation paper where we put together a survey of other approaches that have been done by rating agencies and other sector supervisors that we lean pretty heavily on when calibrating our own approach. I think a lot of these asset classes will be familiar to people on these calls. Sovereigns, cash, these are widely regarded as liquid assets. We put a lot of transparency in the paper about exactly how we did calibrate this and how it stacks up against what others have done. And while we did rely on these other approaches, you do see some tailoring in how we calibrated the liquidity sources. You'll see that in the factors that are applied to investment grade corporate bonds. You'll see it in how we treated GSEs and public sector entities. And we also are looking for your feedback in a couple areas for potentially more tailoring. Specifically, we're looking for feedback on a couple big open issues on how we treat expected future premiums and how we treat assets that were issued by financial institutions. So turning to slide 8 then, on the liquidity needs side, we had better coverage here with the designation methodology. We already had indicators on liability liquidity with the potential policyholder surrenders, and also with derivatives and short-term funding. These were all well recognized as potential transmission channels from insurers with systemic risk. So we had fairly good coverage here, but we did need to supplement that with a couple more areas of liquidity needs that aren't necessarily leading to systemic impact in the same way. So catastrophes, we recognize these aren't having systemic impact usually in the same way, but we wanted, we know these could be potentially big sources of liquidity needs for P&C insurers. So we added a factor there. We also added some granularity. We've heard from your prior feedback on liability liquidity that retail policyholders can behave differently from institutional ones. You'll notice that what's proposed in the ILR does consider whether the policyholder is an institution or just a retail policyholder, with institutions assumed to behave more strategically and having higher liquidity risk. But that's another issue we're looking for feedback on. So I think with that, we are in a good position to open up for questions, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you had.
Thank you very much, Michael and Matt. Maybe we can take a first question that I see on the chat box. There's a question from Ajar Hilali. Is whether the two approaches of the liquidity metrics are intended to be complementary?
Yes, I think we recognize that any one particular metric can have limitations, so I think we're looking to develop a number of liquidity metrics that give us different views on liquidity that we can use to develop our own view of how the sector's liquidity position is at any given time.
Okay, thank you very much. I cannot see any other questions in the chat box, but maybe there's someone that would like from the that would like to ask a question. Can I ask Anya if there's anyone that has raised their hands?
Hello, everyone. We do not have yet raised hands, so I invite the attendees, if they'd like to ask questions, to find the hand sign at the bottom of the attendees list and press it once if they'd like to be unmuted and ask their question verbally. Please. We have now Alan, who would like to ask a question. I will now unmute you, Alan. You now have the floor. Please.
Yes, it's a very simple question. I note that it's a consultation process. Do you have a due date for when the consultation is supposed to stop? When do you want the responses back from insurers who are participating in the consultation?
We do, so I think February 7th at the end of the day. You can correct me if I'm wrong, please, someone from the Secretariat.
Yes, that's correct.
now we have a second question from Miles. Miles, I'm unmuting you now. You have the floor, please. Miles, we have trouble hearing you. Would you like to type your message into the chat box if you can't connect your audio yet? Would that work for you? Not hearing back from Miles, we could go back to his question maybe later once we figure out how to collect the message. Would somebody else like to intervene, please? So Hajar would like to have a follow-up question. Would that be possible?
Sure.
Okay, I'm unmuting Hajar. Hajar, you have the floor now, please.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for the presentation. So I have a second question about the two groups of the liquidity needs. So should they be weighted in the same way, the insurance liquidity needs and the non-insurance liquidity needs?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the way we've dealt with this is just by the factors that are applied. Everything's scaled in such a way that it'll be added up in the denominator. So anything that's getting less than 100% weight, the full value of that is going to be included in the denominator. If you see something with a factor of 50%, only 50% of that will. So you'll notice that the top factor on something like a retail insurance product, I believe, is less than 100%. So it's potentially a lower factor than some other types of business. But we've considered that as we were developing these and how they should, what the relativity should be between insurance and non-insurance liabilities. We looked at some data as part of that, but we'd welcome any feedback you had. I think this was a tough area to calibrate because there's just not as much data there as we would like to set these sort of factors. So welcome any input you had.
I'm giving another go and giving floor to Miles. If you can hear me, Miles, I'm unmuting you. You have the floor now. Would you please try to speak? I suggest that we will get in contact with Miles and collect his question, and we'll answer either at the end of the session or by email following up, because we can't get the line up yet. So if anyone else would like to take the floor, please indicate this. Thank you.
Okay, it seems that we don't have any more questions. Oh, okay. Yes, so we were able to get the question from Miles Heron. So maybe I can pass this question. So the question is, what is the reasoning behind excluding money market funds from sources of liquidity?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think a lot of our definitions and such we had imported from our banking colleagues who had spent quite a bit of time looking at the liquidity of different kinds of assets. I believe funds there are predominantly not treated as the same level of liquidity as some of the underlying assets in the funds, just because you can have differences between a fund and its underlying asset, where the underlying assets may be liquid, but the fund itself can exhibit a different liquidity, particularly in times of stress or the individual fund sponsor is stressed. I think we saw that in the COVID crisis, where I believe this is one of the issues that's on the FSB agenda, to look at the performance of these kind of funds, where there was some large outflows in different asset classes in March.
Thank you very much. So there's another question coming from Cesar Neves. And the question is, how did we measure the weight in liquidity sources?
So on the liquidity sources side, within the table, or within the paper, there's a table that shows just how we compare it to different approaches, standard setters. A lot of this was based on supervisory judgment. We didn't find academic studies that really had calibrated how liquid different asset classes were, but we did line up how liquid different people has treated them as based on their own research or whatever studies they had conducted. So you'll see in table 3 in the paper on page 11 how the BCBS treats a given asset class, how S&P treats an asset class, how AM Best treats an asset class, and these were a lot of what we based our own reasoning and factors on. But we would appreciate any thoughts you had. If there's something else we should consider when setting these, we'd like to know.
Thank you very much. So I don't see any other question or any other raised hand. Is that correct, Anya?
I confirm.
Okay. So thank you very much, Michael and Matt, for this presentation. And with that, I suggest that we move on to the second part of this call with the consultation on the application paper on resolution powers and planning. And for that, I will ask Alex Hart, the chair of the resolution working group, to take the floor and present the paper. Alex, it's for you.
Thank you, Romain, and welcome to everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. We certainly appreciate you all taking a bit of time out of your days to chat with us and then learn about the consultations that are currently open. The resolution working group has published an application paper on resolution powers and planning that was approved last month. So as you know, application papers are a part of the IAIS development of supervisory material and supporting materials. The supervisory material includes the insurance core principles, or ICPs, which apply to all insurers in all jurisdictions, and ComFrame, which is more specifically focused on internationally active insurance groups, or IAIGs. The supporting material developed by the IAIS includes application papers and issues papers, And it should be noted that the supporting materials do not create new standards in addition to what's published in the ICPs and ComFrame. We also, in the supervisory material and supporting material, acknowledged the role of the proportionality principle. And as you look at the application paper on resolution powers and planning, you'll see various mentions of proportionality throughout, both with respect to the application of resolution powers and in the requirements or suggested contents for a resolution plan. Next slide, please. So the relevant supervisory material from which the material in the application paper is drawn is ICP 12, which is exit from the market and resolution, and the ComFrame sections integrated into it that lay out the resolution framework for insurers, including the resolution powers, resolution planning, and management information systems requirements. Standard ICP 16.15 and the ComFrame material therein also include requirements for recovery plans, which we covered about a year ago in an application paper on recovery planning that was adopted in November of 2019. Further relevant supervisory material includes ICP 25 on supervisory coordination and cooperation and its ComFrame components that provide requirements for crisis preparation and management, including a requirement for crisis management groups to be put in place for IAIGs. Next slide, please. So the way we've organized the application paper, the major sections of the paper include the objectives and concepts of resolution, which is the basic point at which to start. Concepts around the point of non-viability and entry into resolution. I'd note, too, that much of the material contained in the paper evolved from comments and or questions that were raised in the consultations on the ICP and ComFrame materials, as well as in a stakeholder session that the Resolution Working Group held in April of this year, which seems like an awfully long time ago, but it really wasn't. So we've tried to fold into the paper the responses and or answers to those comments and questions that were raised as explanatory kind of material to further expound on what is in the ICPs and ComFrame. So we cover resolution powers, which I'll touch on a bit more in detail in a second. We also cover resolution planning, which likewise I'll give a bit more attention to detail in a second. We talk about resolvability assessments and coordination and cooperation among the authorities that are involved in a resolution. Next slide, please. On the resolution powers, we decided to group the resolution powers kind of thematically. I should note that there is no particular order to the powers. None are more or less important than another, but we group them in this way such that, again, themes would be put together and show how some of the powers interact and need to be hand in hand in order to effect a good, solid resolution. So we've talked about powers that deal with taking control of the insurer that's in resolution, the prohibition of certain payments and transfers that are necessary in a resolution, withdrawal of the license to write new business and placement into runoff. There's a fairly lengthy discussion in the paper about runoff, both solvent and insolvent. We also talk about restructuring mechanisms where liquidation is not necessary, but yet the insurer needs some type of restructuring of its business or operations in order to return to profitable and solvent operation. Suspension of various rights is covered, as is liquidation, which unfortunately is the bottom line in resolution. If all else fails and there's no way to rehabilitate or restructure an insurer to put it in or to run it off successfully, liquidation is the option. We also list out some specific powers that are required for IAIGs that again are reflected in the ComFrame material included in ICP 12. Next slide, please. On resolution planning, we did get a number of questions and comments in the ICP and ComFrame consultation regarding, well, what should be in a resolution plan to make it sound. So, you know, we first talk about the objective of resolution planning, which are to identify in advance options for resolving all or parts of an insurer. The ultimate goal is to be better prepared for resolution. It serves as a guide to resolution authorities for achieving an orderly resolution where recovery measures aren't going to work anymore or have been unsuccessful. We talk about some concrete examples for decisions around the scope of the requirement. And again, as I mentioned earlier, herein is where proportionality takes a greater role. So the guidance around the key elements of a resolution plan that we included, an executive summary to begin with, which includes the resolvability assessment, which is just simply that. It's an evaluation of the insurer to be resolved, and any impediments to the potential successful resolution are discussed. A description of the group, including its legal structure, financial and operational dependencies. We need to understand the scope of the group, what is or what is not included in potential resolution measures. We discuss a trigger framework for entry into resolution. Some of these are qualitative, some of these are quantitative, but they nonetheless point towards where an insurer would have major problems from which it would be difficult to recover. We talk about the analysis of the impact of the failure on other parts of the financial system and or on the real economy. I think that speaks well for itself. But we do look at interconnectedness there. A description of the preferred resolution strategy. There may be more ways to attack than one. An operational plan for the implementation of that resolution strategy. A description of the governance for resolution planning and the resolution process, which includes senior management and the board of directors, as well as the supervisory and or resolution authorities. Communication strategy, both to the public and to the supervisor and resolution authority. And last, an analysis of the impact on policyholder protection schemes if one does exist. Next slide, please. Which brings us to any questions the audience may have. Anya, I'll open the floor.
Thank you very much. I think Cesar might have a question. I will unmute you now, Cesar. You have the floor. Please let us know. Hello, Cesar? Cesar Neves? You have the floor now if you have a question.
Sorry. I talked with my daughter the night about
Anya, I can barely hear the speaker.
Okay, I suggest that Cesar writes us a note in chat, and we will read it aloud if he wishes. I invite other participants. Please raise your hand through the raise hand button, which is situated at the bottom of the attendees list. Please, thank you. You can also write us a chat message if you'd like to communicate in writing. Thank you.
Alex, it seems that you have answered all the questions in your presentation. I see.
That's good.
Yes, exactly. Congratulations. But I see that we have a question. Anya, from the.
Yes, we have one question in the chat box from Murak. Can you expand upon those issues specific to IAIGs? Thank you.
Okay, thank you for the question. Again, as noted in the various parts of ICP 12, there are outlines for IAIGs in the ComFrame material, some of which are a bit more extensive, a bit more detailed than what is more nearly guidance for all other insurers in the ICPs. There's a fair degree of material throughout that is more applicable to IAIGs, and it's the actual details of which are unfortunately escaping me at the moment, because there is a fair amount of that material. But it is laid out very clearly in the application paper when we are discussing those measures that are applicable only to IAIGs.
Thank you very much, Alex. So, Anya, do we have any other question?
Thank you very much. I do not have other questions or raised hands. And the question we had privately through the chat, we will respond also privately. Thank you very much.
All right, so that's maybe a last chance if anyone, but okay, it seems not. So thank you very much, Alex, for this presentation. And let me then just conclude. Can we move on to the next slide, please? Just in terms of the process for these two consultations. And as you know, a consultation is a very important component of our process at the IAIS. So regarding the development of liquidity metrics phase 1, the exposure approach, your feedback is invited by the 7th of February 2021 at midnight Basel time. The feedback will be taken into account while the IAIS continues its work on developing a set of liquidity monitoring metrics. For the application paper on the resolution powers and planning, the feedback on this draft application paper is invited by Friday, 5 February 2021 at midnight Basel time. And the final application paper is expected to be published along with the resolution of the comments received around mid-2021. I would like to remind you that only comments that will be provided via the IIS consultation tool will be considered in this process. So with that, I of course encourage you to take part to this consultation. It's really now the floor is really yours for that. And I'm looking forward also to seeing you at our annual conference this week. Thank you very much and have a nice day. And thanks very much, of course, to our distinguished presenters, Michael Popp, Matt Walker, and Alex Hart for the excellent presentation. Thank you very much and goodbye.